The AstraZeneca COVID vaccine is being withdrawn worldwide.
Notably, this decision comes weeks after AstraZeneca admitted that the vaccine can cause blood clots.
Hello and welcome to the Nexus. This week we're looking at why AstraZeneca is withdrawing its COVID vaccine from the market. Is it for commercial reasons, as the company says, or something more worrying? Alex Mitchell received $150,000 in damages from the UK government because he lost his leg after taking the vaccine. And we'll be hearing from him in a moment. But first, here's a quick reminder of how we got here.
Well, the vaccine means everything to me.
82-year-old Brian Pinker was the first person ever to receive the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine outside of clinical trials. And now, 3 years later, the company is taking it off the market.
AstraZeneca is withdrawing its COVID-19 vaccine worldwide.
AstraZeneca say, well, they're pulling it because it's been superseded by other vaccines.
The timing of this withdrawal is interesting.
Just a week before the announcement, AstraZeneca was in court, defending itself against a class action lawsuit brought by more than 50 victims and their families, who are seeking up to $125 million in damages.
It's not statistics to us, it's an actual loved human being who died.
It was in court that AstraZeneca acknowledged for the first time that the vaccine could cause rare and fatal side effects, including blood clots. Big pharma critics online exploded.
AstraZeneca, as a result of the legal acknowledgement that their product causes blood clots, in very rare cases, have been forced to globally withdraw it.
This is months after admitting in court of the side effect. Rare. What's the definition of rare?
It is rare, but that does not excuse this.
AstraZeneca maintains its decision is down to commercial reasons, and on the face of it, that might be true. In 2021, the company earned a staggering $4 billion from the vaccine. In 2022, it was just $1.8 billion, and by 2023, just $12 million in revenue. Of course, AstraZeneca insists that money wasn't its main goal, it was trying to save lives. 3 billion doses were given worldwide, and it claims that in 2021 alone, it saved 6.5 million lives around the world. The company maintains it kept people from either dying or being taken to hospital 100% of the time after 2 doses.
I just had my first AstraZeneca vaccine, and quite literally, I did not feel a thing.
It may well have saved a lot of lives, but the UK government's own vaccine compensation fund has made 163 payments to victims. Of those, 158 payments, the vast majority, went to people who had taken the AstraZeneca vaccine. Official figures from Britain's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency shows AstraZeneca vaccines linked to at least 81 blood clot deaths in the UK. The risk of blood clots was known quite early on. The European Medicines Agency approved the AstraZeneca vaccine in January 2021, and within weeks there were reports of serious side effects. 8 European countries suspended its use, but despite those concerns, the vaccine was still used in over 170 countries. The European Medicines Agency and AstraZeneca initially maintained that there was no connection between the vaccine and reports of serious side effects, and distribution of the vaccine continued.
With all the news, we were a bit concerned, but because we've already had the first jab, I think it's better to carry on with the second one.
Okay, let's bring in Alex Mitchell now. He lost his leg after taking the AstraZeneca vaccine and was later awarded the equivalent of $150,000 by the UK government. Alex, welcome to the programme. That payment then was official recognition that the vaccine caused the loss of your leg?
Yes, that's an acknowledgement by the UK government, so in vaccine damage payment scheme, Matthew. Thank you very much for inviting me on the show. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah. And can you tell us how the doctors showed that there was a link between the vaccine and what happened to you?
Well, in my case, the vascular surgeon I presented with, because I collapsed at home, had recognised that this was something that she had never seen before. And one of the task force of the haematology team were based at the same hospital. So she flagged them up, and that's where really they started to look into try and figure out what was going wrong. By the end of the week in isolation, it was pretty much certain that they only had one other option. They'd looked at everything else in my life, and that came out that they were trial suspected, but they had to do the final test, which takes about 13 to 14 days to get the final results.
Now, the vaccine was approved in January, and 2 months later in March, you took it. And you are aware, as we all are, that there were discussions, sort of privately, between the UK government and AstraZeneca and amongst European countries that serious side effects were being reported.
We found out after the fact that the Danish Health Authority had actually sent out an alert to notify that they had these cases that we now are recognised as VIC cases, and the UK government didn't release that information to about the 11th of April.
And had they done so, would that have changed your opinion about whether or not to take the vaccine?
Of course. I wouldn't go near anything that had any risks. I wasn't taking this for me. This was to protect the old people, the vulnerable, the sick that were round about of us. They asked us to do the right thing, protect lives, save the NHS and do the right thing. Yeah. And that's what I did. I thought I was doing. Clearly, it's the biggest wrong decision I've ever made in my life.
And you were only 56 at the time and had no other underlying health issues. So had you not taken it, you personally would most likely have been fine had you caught COVID.
I would, practically zero risk, because with no underlying health conditions, at 56, yeah, I'm a bit older, but the physical shape I was in doing the job I did,
yeah,
and I was outside, so my sort of autoimmune system was as robust as anything going, so I didn't need this for me.
Mm. Are you angry at the government and at the drug makers for keeping information to themselves?
I have got an anger inside me. It's not healthy for any human being to have now. It's bad enough dealing with the trauma of what's happened to you and losing a leg and other things on a personal level. That's one issue, is to deal with the trauma of being treated the way I've been treated for 3 years by the very same government that asked me to do the right thing. And the mainstream media, who just sort of silenced, ignored us and labelled us. You know, this is the bit where I'm getting very upset at being labelled an anti-vaxxer or a conspiracy theorist.
You featured in a Rolling Stone article and other articles and have been criticised, as you say, for being an anti-vaxxer. What sort of remarks and reporting have you had?
I've had social media comments where people said, "Go and die, you should have died. We wish you'd have lost both legs. Could it not have been your tongue? That would maybe shut you up. You're a liar. I'm a grifter. I'm a crisis actor." You can call me what you want. That's not going to change the truth of what happened to you.
And it's not going to change the fact that the government vaccine damage payment scheme, as you know, as I say, awarded you £120,000 or $150,000, which is in itself, as you say, an official acknowledgement of sorts. And not only that, you're actually pursuing AstraZeneca in the courts as part of a class action lawsuit. What is the case that your lawyer is making?
I think the basic premise is, obviously, if you want the total legal definition, my lawyer was quite happy to provide it, but it's basically that the product was not as safe as it was intended to be for the general public, or was as expected to be. And nobody was warned of a clotting issues or any other issues. I was verbally told that I would have flu-like symptoms for 48 hours and a sore sight arm. That's the sum total of the informed consent I had.
And yet AstraZeneca is now defending its vaccine, saying that it has saved well over 6 million lives globally. What do you make of that?
Well, all these estimations of lives saved are exactly one thing: someone's guess at life saved. I've asked for 3 years for anyone independently to give me credible evidence of the lives it saved, and I've not got it once. Yet I can give you literally hundreds of cases of death certificates, medical records showing this is causing many deaths and destroying many lives.
Except AstraZeneca goes on to defend itself by saying that it is safe and that just 2 or 3 out of 100,000 people have developed TTS, which is related to blood clots and thrombosis. What do you make of that as a defence?
Well, they're trying to use figures to make it look worse. You said 2 or 3 per 100,000. There's 67 million people in the UK. Extrapolate those numbers. They're horrific for a product to be able to do that. You can use stats all you want. Nothing takes away from the fact this is all human beings. There's 158 cases being acknowledged that this is AstraZeneca by the UK Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme. AstraZeneca can defend all they want. This company's paid over 1.5 billion fines in the last 20 years and committed 32 corporate crimes. So I'm not listening to anything they've got to say. They can deal with my legal team.
If I could just ask you to speculate for a moment, AstraZeneca withdrawing their vaccine from markets around the world, what do you make of that?
Well, it's been withdrawn globally, and it's one of the few positives that I've had in 3 years that I now know within my heart for 100% that not one single other human being is going to possibly end up like me or worse.
Can I ask you just finally, you know, we read out in your introduction that you lost your leg after taking the vaccine, and it's easy to say, but it's, you know, it's an incredibly life-changing injury to you. How are you dealing with it?
I'd love to say, well, I'm not. It's a roller coaster because I'm not getting the time to actually deal with the trauma of what's happened to me because I can't get help and support, proper help and support. Until that trauma is resolved, my recovery path is always going to be limited. It's always going to be limited anyway because of the impact. You know, it's more than an amputation. I've got eye issues, sight issues, I've got brain issues, I've got issues with my other leg, and there's other internal issues that's going on. So it's not just one thing what you see, it's the internal destruction that this has done to the human body.
And to your psychology?
Well, I've always been a very strong mental person, and for me, it was I didn't have a choice, because if I sat in a corner and felt sorry for myself, I would be the biggest hypocrite that I could ever think of, and I've sold out my whole life's morals, principles, ethics and standards, and I refuse to let this change the inner core of me as much as possible.
And what about your mission to help others? How important is that to you?
It's everything to me now, because I shouldn't be here. Medical professionals gave my wife, my 2 daughters, the news that there was no hope. And I opened my eyes. The words were, you shouldn't be here. But here I am. So yeah, I take it very personal and responsible for those that no longer have a voice, or maybe not strong enough or fit enough or healthy enough. I don't know how long I can do this, but while I can, this is far bigger than me. This is not about money. No amount of money is going to give me my life or my leg back. This is about proper justice, what's fair. Do the decent thing, do the right thing. You've made me an ordinary man who should never be on programmes like this, take to the streets because you're refusing to help and support me.
Alex Mitchell, thanks so much for sharing your experiences with us today. Much appreciated. Now, we're going to put some of Alex's points to a virologist in just a moment, but first, let's hear from the general public and what they make of AstraZeneca's decision to withdraw the vaccine.
Did you hear about the AstraZeneca vaccine being pulled from the market?
Who hasn't?
Yeah. How does that make you feel?
Fooled by the media and by the government, because I was assured that, they were convincing me that these are safe to take, and well, it turns out it was very much otherwise.
The benefits of millions are being saved, then 2 people dying of the vaccine doesn't bother me.
It makes me scared because we all got it. So all the people that got it, now they took it away, but then they didn't and they gave it to everybody. So what's going to happen to us?
It was suspect to me. Do you know what I mean? How quickly that vaccine came out. I don't know how much good it did.
I never got sick or had any reaction to AstraZeneca. Take some Panadol and it might affect somebody differently to the next person.
I didn't take it. It was created too soon. And I was quite sceptical from the start. I didn't get any COVID vaccines, and I do not want to get any COVID vaccine. All of these vaccines were untested or not tested properly.
Okay, let's bring in Chris Smith now. He's a consultant virologist at a hospital here in the UK and host of the popular Naked Scientist podcast. Chris, welcome to the programme. As we heard in our Vox Pops just then, a lot of people think that AstraZeneca only really withdrew their product, not because of commercial reasons, as they stated, but because they have been forced to admit that it caused blood clots. So which explanation do you think is most likely?
Well, cards on the table. I'm not a member of the pharmaceutical industry. I'm not in the pay of the pharmaceutical industry, so I don't have any conflicts of interest. So I'm regarding this situation as purely from a medical standpoint, as a medical consultant. And all drugs go through a lifetime where they're created, they're tested and evaluated, and then they're continued to be monitored over their lifetime of use to check they're safe. And if at any point in that journey there's any kind of indication of a lack of safety or a problem emerging, then that drug is reviewed. And drugs do fall by the wayside. They're superseded by better drugs, they're superseded by drugs that have fewer side effects. And under these circumstances, it may well be that AstraZeneca have made both a commercial decision but also a safety decision to do this. And we don't know, because they haven't answered that question on your programme, and certainly I don't know what's in their minds.
When it comes to safety, AstraZeneca says that their vaccine was very safe. And in fact, only 2 or 3 people out of 100,000 would get serious side effects like blood clots. Now, in the world of virology, is that an acceptable number?
Well, I think one has to consider, when you take a step back and look at the broader picture, 1 in 50,000 people becoming seriously unwell or losing their life is a tragedy. However one looks at it, it's a tragedy. And in medicine, the Hippocratic oath we all sign up to as doctors is that we do no harm. So whenever that sort of outcome occurs, we always feel very bad for the person that that's happened to, but also for the profession, because that is absolutely what we never want to happen. But unfortunately, one has to regard the pharmaceutical industry as a moving train. The way this works, the way we make drugs and make medicines, is very much not like you would expect if you went to a shoe shop. If you went into a shoe shop, you would reasonably expect them to measure your feet and give you a pair of shoes that was going to fit you well, and serve their purpose. Now, when we do medicine, we're giving drugs a bit like you going into that same shoe shop and them taking the first pair of shoes off the shelf and giving them to you and saying, you will wear these. Not personalised at all, because we're not yet in a position where we can tailor a treatment to a person's biochemistry and a person's genetics. And while we try to do that, and clinical trials do try to make the best pair of shoes that will fit the most people most comfortably most of the time, there will always be exceptions. And unfortunately, we end up with circumstances, in rare circumstances, where those exceptions are that a person may have adverse outcomes.
Right.
And the lens they would have been looking at this through during the pandemic was one that this is an emergency situation, that we do know there are very real threats posed to some people by the coronavirus that's causing COVID. They will lose their lives. And as AstraZeneca themselves have said, that their vaccine was given to billions and has saved millions. And so when one considers that it has saved enormous numbers of lives, that's a plus. But that doesn't belittle the fact that some people did have serious adverse
Some
outcomes.
people like Alex Mitchell, who were just on our programme, who say they're not content to be a statistic, and that it's not a good enough explanation that just 1 or 2 out of every 50,000, 100,000 might get seriously ill, because there was dishonesty in the early part of 2021. Dishonesty from governments and from AstraZeneca. They both, the governments and the pharmaceutical firms, knew right at the beginning of January 2021 that these side effects existed, and they didn't do enough to alert the public to that.
I remember being on the radio when these reports began to emerge. They came from a number of European countries and from our own countries, but it wasn't entirely clear straight away what was going on, because the side effect that was being reported of blood clots, well, that happens to a small, unfortunate number of people anyway, regardless of whether they've been vaccinated. So what politicians, policymakers and regulators wanted to avoid was scaring people, saying something was happening when in fact it wasn't, and that would then remove the use of the potentially very, very important drug or vaccine from use, potentially unnecessarily. So they had to make sure that they had the story right, they had the facts, and that took time, I think. As soon as they began to notice that there was a signal, there was an effect, they did take it very seriously, and quite quickly we got the mechanism
and yet in
of
eight,
what we think was going on.
And yet in 8 other European countries, the use of AstraZeneca was suspended. Shouldn't the UK have done the same thing?
Well, you could do, as I suggested earlier, and look at this from different perspective, which is that that vaccine did save millions of lives. And how many people would not have been vaccinated and might have lost their life because of a COVID infection had it been withdrawn in order to not have the risk of an unconfirmed at that stage side effect. Now that would have been what was going through the minds of the regulators. That's the decision they have to make, because this is the real difficulty. Both healthy economics and also regulators have to weigh up the pros and cons of any kind of medical intervention.
You do, but then Alex would
say...
say...
no medicine that isn't without side effects.
Sure, so I guess there's a risk calculus there, but Alex was only in his mid-50s and had no underlying health conditions. So actually, had the risk been explained to him properly, he might have opted not to, well, he said he certainly would not have opted to have taken the vaccine, especially if the government had been more open about the problems with the vaccine that were occurring immediately. Almost immediately it was approved.
Yeah, I feel very sorry for people who are in that position and people who have lost loved ones. I luckily didn't have any side effects when I had these vaccines. The problem, though, is that it's very easy to be wise in retrospect. When you're trying to make these decisions, and I'm not one of those policymakers, I'm just someone who was involved in providing care to patients, but the people who were making those decisions, on the one hand, they're trying to protect a large number of people, and they're being told by the statisticians, by the people doing the epidemiology, there's an enormous number of people who are at very high risk, and if they catch this disease, we're going to see this number of people who are losing their lives. On the other hand, they're being told, well, there are some people who might be at risk of this side effect. There are some people who might be at risk of a side effect that we don't know about yet. And so they're trying to make a balancing judgment. Well, which is the worst? What's the lesser of the two evils? And this is a really tough call to make. And it's based on information which is only accumulating over time and very patchy. And if you think about what was happening with these vaccines in the early days, we didn't roll them out everywhere for everybody all at the same time. We tended to take an age-related priority pecking order. And so older people who we knew were at greatest risk of COVID being severe, they were prioritised. Now those people have the lower risk of getting these sorts of side effects with this particular vaccine. Other countries took a slightly different approach. So the data were emerging in quite a patchy way. And it meant that drawing valid comparisons between what was happening in different countries, different jurisdictions, and with different vaccines was quite difficult. And it muddied the waters. And so it wasn't, I don't think, that people set out to deceive. I don't think for a minute people set out to deceive anybody. I think that the information they were probably relying on was patchy at the time, and they were being asked to make very tough decisions.
Well, we know that a lot of people took the vaccine not because they felt that they needed to take it, even looking at the risk calculus table of their age and health versus the risk of becoming ill after taking the vaccine, but because the government put in various measures to put pressure on them. For example, to get a vaccine passport in order to get the right QR code to visit certain shops and so on. Do you think, going forward, that the government ought to leave those sort of measures out of their epidemiological kind of policy, if you like?
Well, let's also remember that it wasn't just our government. In order to travel overseas, other governments were doing equally,
yes. Do you think all governments should refrain from putting that sort of pressure on the population, especially as the population isn't being given all the information that is available to policymakers, because they also need to make decisions about their own particular and personal health?
Yep, It's difficult, this one. I was having a similar conversation with someone earlier this week when we were thinking about the pressure that was being brought to bear on medical practitioners. And it got to the point where people were on the verge of being dismissed because they hadn't been vaccinated in certain circumstances, even though one of them was able to prove he had antibody levels at least as high as if he'd been vaccinated because he had caught the virus. It makes me very uncomfortable when we're in a situation where we start to force medical interventions on people, and I'm much more of a carrot, not a stick type thinker. I think that we give people information, we give people clear information that is unbiased and impartial and reliable and as up-to-date as we can make it, and then we allow people to make their own decision. But the question then becomes, well, if you're working with people, if you're working in an environment where there are vulnerable people, are you entirely comfortable to have a person who could come to work and catch an infection and then spread that infection to other members of staff and to vulnerable people in a hospital? And that was the problem that confronted policymakers.
Chris Smith, thank you so much for your contributions to the Nexus today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes again, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.